This is 11th of October in Fiji, Monday morning. This is our 10:30 session of the conference. Session 2, History, Legacy of Indenture and Construction of Identities. This morning from Fiji, we have three presenters or presentations for this session. I'm not sure whether we might have any more joining in, but first on my list is Anjali Singh from Mohanlal Sukhadia University in Udaipur, India. Her title of the presentation is Floating Identities, Twice Migrants of the Indenture Diaspora. She is around, but she has a recorded presentation, and that is what we are going to play now. And soon after that, we will wait for the other two presenters, and hopefully they join us. Thank you, and we start now.
Good morning, friends and fellow participants, the conference organizers and members of the audience. I am Anjali Singh from the Department of English, Mohanlal Sukhadia University, Udaipur, India. And my presentation today is on floating identities, twice migrants of the Indenture diaspora. My paper extrapolates the experience of displacement and homelessness, which has been a source of anxiety for the twice migrants, consequently giving rise to a distinct social formation in the Indian diaspora. I will not go through the whole background to the indenture because everyone here already knows about it, but I will begin with an iconic quote by Salman Rushdie in Imaginary Homelands. He argues that the past is a country from which we have all immigrated, and that its loss is a part of our common humanity. It is important to note here that the indenture system was never meant to be permanent. The immigrants did not arrive in the new land with the objective of making it their permanent home. However, history proved differently. The long voyage on the ships from the east coast of India across the Indian and Atlantic Oceans to the plantation colonies was just the beginning of the sense of homelessness and loss of identity, which would pursue the indentured Indians as well as the subsequent generations for all time. Marianne Hirsch's concept of post-memory, although she used it for survivors of the Holocaust and it has been used to define the condition of migrants elsewhere, can be used to explain the belated memories of indenture that are experienced by those who do not directly bear witness to it. In his short story, Exiles in a Park, Subramani highlights the emotions of a group of Indo-Fijians who have been twice removed and are now living in Australia. He writes, "We are living the afterlife of that story, or altogether a different story, probably someone else's story. When does one story end, another begin?" he writes. The first reconstruction of identity for the indentured people took place on the floating liminal ship that bore them across the oceans from their motherland or homeland to the host country. This was the first instance of diasporic remove from India. On their arrival in the host countries, the sense of isolation from the homeland was absolute. The host countries did not accept them with open arms. Even after indenture had ended, the children born to indentured parents developed an exilic perspective, which was supported by a double consciousness, which in turn highlighted the memory of an imagined homeland. Shunned by the natives as outsiders and by their own Indian brethren in India as outcasts, the indentured Indians were literally and metaphorically cast adrift and left to float. Historian Brij Vilal in Chalo Jahaji writes, "Once they had served their indenture, the Indians were left to their own devices. Returning to India was not an option for many as they had been dispossessed of their homes in their native villages. However, staying on in the host country presented its own set of problems." V.S. Naipaul in the Middle Passage writes, "Living in a borrowed culture, the West Indian, more than most, needs writers to tell him who he is and where he stands." Jahaji, Frank Birbal Singh's anthology, contains potent narratives on the Indo-Caribbean indentured experience. It focuses on the issues of immigration, as well as the outsider experience of the Indo-Caribbean diaspora. The stories throw light on the hyphenated identity of the twice migrants and projects their experience as one beset with the anxiety of displacement and finally disillusionment. In this second shift or removal of the diaspora, the modalities of identity and representation are in a sense displaced, accounting for multiplicity in the meaning of identity. The job interview by Singh in the anthology realistically illustrates the predicament faced by her protagonist, Krish, who is a twice migrant. His grandparents hailed from India and were indentured to a plantation in Trinidad. His parents moved to the UK before he was born. The confusion faced by him over his status, whether he is a citizen or an immigrant, is brought out clearly and evocatively through his feeling of alienation and exile in what he considers his home. The questions underlying the story remain unanswered till the end. Krish wonders, what is my point of origin? Where do I call home? The process of answering this question for the twice migrants is more complex, since a homeland is always a prerequisite starting point from where an identity is felt to originate. A cultural identity necessitates rooting a shared culture in a historical past. Post-colonial theorist Stuart Hall in Cultural Identity and Diaspora describes identities as the names we give to different ways we are positioned by and position ourselves within the narratives of the past. Hall sees cultural identity being enacted in at least two different ways. The experience of the twice migrants, while emphasizing the issues of migrancy, also evaluates their negotiating, interrogating, and navigating the cultural constructs involved in aiding the emergence of a new hybrid identity. Historian Brinsley Samaru suggests in India and the Caribbean that the West Indian East Indians will neither be West Indian nor East Indian until they first of all come to terms. Identity necessitates rooting a shared culture in a historical past. Post-colonial theorist Stuart Hall in Cultural Identity and Diaspora describes identities as the names we give to different ways we are positioned by and position ourselves within the narratives of the past. Hall sees cultural identity being enacted in at least two different ways. The experience of the twice migrants, while emphasizing the issues of migrancy, also evaluates their negotiating, interrogating, and navigating the cultural constructs involved in aiding the emergence of a new hybrid identity. Historian Brinsley Samaru suggests in India and the Caribbean that the West Indian East Indians will neither be West Indian nor East Indian until they first of all come to terms with themselves. And this process certainly involves an understanding of their Indian connection. Thus, identity is constructed or reconstructed through a shared past and a shared presence in order to find the answer to the elusive, who am I? Singh's story opens with the protagonist, Krish, being offered a summer job at IBM London. She narrates how Krish, while growing up, had been embarrassed and annoyed with the West Indian lilt in his mother's speech. Each time he would point out to his mother that she was a Trinidadian while he was British. The refrain would be, how come yeah is English? I tell you already, yeah is Trinidadian, just like me. When he turned 9, Krishna, the Hindu name with which he had been christened at birth, consciously started calling himself Krish. This change in the name was necessitated by the fundamental question of identity and a bid for adaptation and assimilation in the country into which he had been born and to which he thought he belonged. However, his sense of belonging has always remained under question. Why? He was English, but the British considered him an Indian. The Indians considered him Trinidadian, and the Trinidadians considered him either English or Indian, but never their own. The ignorance and indifference of the people he considers friends results in the creation of stereotypes, whereas the loss of shared ethnicity with the Indians creates a vacuum in his mind. He is caught in the vortex of identity reconstruction and acculturation, which can be viewed through a multitude of emotions which he exhibits. They range from denial to anger, to racial segregation, to nostalgia, guilt, and finally, helplessness. His school friends and mates are ignorant and indifferent in their perception of the historical and contemporary social struggles faced by his people. In school, Krish chooses to play football instead of cricket, a move that annoys his father. He wants his son to play cricket as it was in his heritage. However, even though Krish is a good football player, he is made to sit on the bench and is never allowed to play any match. As a 13-year-old, he faces a paradox and realizes that finding friends is like fighting a losing battle. The milk chocolate Chris has grown up receiving a stare, a giggle, or sometimes even a shove against a desk. Identity is a performative act with certain facets being highlighted in certain situations, while cultural identity itself undergoes transformation. When his father puts him in a West Indian social group so that he can make friends, Chris is perplexed at finding that everyone there had black, frizzy hair. When he tries to connect with them, he is shunned and treated as an outcast by the latter. They say, "You said you was English. You don't sound like a trainee to me. And I think this group is for children from there." This exchange thus illustrates in a very stark manner the loss of shared ethnicity. Cut loose and set adrift to float, the homeland is lost twice to the twice migrants. When he tries to correct his girlfriend Sarah that he's not from India, he is unable to explain or to understand and make her understand the concept or the system of Indian indenture. Chris says that he isn't from India. "My grandparents were, but my family's from Trinidad." He insists on being called British. "I was born here. I am not an immigrant." Finally, at the end of his tether and backed by a lifetime faced resolving the crisis of identity and belonging, Chris explodes on Sarah. "Your country grabbed up cheap Indian labor and stuck them in their colonies. Did your precious country not teach you that in your history lessons? We were dragged, whipped, beaten, and killed just so your country could get rich." This explosive encounter leaves him anxious and confused. From an identification as a Brit, in a second he switches and he identifies with India. Now, what happens is he starts to question his identity, and on the way to the interview where he was supposed to be going, he comes face to face with the void again, with a sense of emptiness which is compounded by helplessness. During the course of the interview, Chris relives the sense of exile and alienation that has been a part of all those who have faced a double migration. On being asked whether he's from Deptford, he responds after a lot of thinking, "I do live in Deptford, and I've never lived anywhere else, but that's not where I am from." Urged to answer where he actually comes from and taunted that it is not a difficult question, Chris responds almost furtively, "I really don't know." This poignant and evocative answer captures the very essence of loss that is inherent to the twice migrants. Thus, the exilic perspective of the twice migrants references the rise of a different poetics, showcasing how the memory of an imagined homeland plays a big role in reconstruction and negotiation of cultural identity. This new floating identity of the migrated citizen affects the longing to belong, since the migrant constantly juggles between adapting to the idea of the citizenship of the migrated land against the idea of being a neglected citizen of the motherland. I rest my case here. Thank you so much for listening to me, for giving me such a patient hearing. I would like to stop sharing my screen now. And thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Anjali and Ranjit, for sharing that presentation. It was brilliantly put, let me say this. Anjali's presentation was perfect, and I think the way it relates to the idea of floating identity is brilliant. And I think these are, real life experiences of people. I do remember, my, village friends when they ended up in Sydney, and when I met them there, the other friends were relating to this guy whose name was Suresh, calling him Steve. And I thought, I thought that was funny, and also I was very angry why he was shedding off his very important, Fijian and the village, identity of being Suresh and not Steve that I ever knew of. Anyway, that's the story of many people who are, for the reason of circumstances, have to migrate from one country to the other. And in the case of Fiji, and I'm sure the same applies to those in the Caribbean and other parts of the world who leave one country for the other, by way of compulsion because they have to move. So that was brilliant, Anjali. We would now go on to the second presentation by Naidu. He is the president of the New Zealand Gurmit Foundation in Auckland, and his title of the presentation is Identity, Discrimination, and Implications. I'm not sure whether he is with us here. If not, then we will play his recording.
Kia ora koutou, winaka, namaste, keisehe. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to be part of this conference. I want to say a big thank you to the organizing committee and a very happy New Zealand Fijian Language Week to you all. My name is Krish Naidu, and I'm a senior lecturer in business at Otago Polytech, Auckland campus. And I'm also a consultant, and I sit on a number of community and education boards. And in addition to that, I'm the president of Fiji Gurmit Foundation New Zealand, which is a community organization looking after heritage, identity, and we do a lot of advocacy work for our people. And I have got a lot of passion, pride when it comes to identity and advocacy for our people. It is a huge privilege to be able to present what we've been doing, in terms of our community engagements. And today, I just want to briefly touch on the issue of identity in New Zealand for the descendants of Gurmitians, Fiji Indians or Fijian Indians or Indo-Fijians, whichever terminology you want to use to describe our people. Now, this is a complex issue, the identity issue, but it has real implications for our people, especially in the areas of education, areas of health, basically around policy making. And I will take you into a journey of how this whole thing started. So in 2019, at the 140th Gurmit anniversary in Auckland, we put up a demand to the government that Fijian Indians who have been living in New Zealand for so many years, we need to be treated with respect and dignity. We need to belong to a Pacific community, Pacific people's community, and to be governed and supported by the Ministry of Pacific People, just like other people from the Pacific are. Rotuman brothers and sisters, or Itoke indigenous brothers and sisters. There is no reason why Fijian Indians should not be part of Pacific people. And we actually meet the definition requirements, but we continue to fall off the crack. So we were told to meet up with Stats New Zealand, which is the governing body for collection of data. It's a Crown agency. And after the meetings with ministers, we met up formally with Stats New Zealand, and we tried to understand why we are classified as Asians in New Zealand. So if you identify yourself as a Fijian in the stats form, census form, then you get coded under Pacific classification. But if you identify yourself as Fiji Indian or Fijian Indian, you get coded under Asian classification. So in New Zealand, we have a number of broad classification, such as European, Maori, Asian, Pacific people, and all people from the Pacific, Niueans, Cook Island, Samoans, Tongans, they all come under the Pacific people classification. But if you're a Fijian Indian, you get classified as Asians. But the funny thing here is this. We all know constitutionally in Fiji, there's been a change, and the word Fijian is an umbrella term to include all of us. And in New Zealand, people do not have an understanding of this. And the Itoke, indigenous Fijian, are perceived to be the Fijians, and people with biological Indian traits like myself, we are pushed under the Asian bracket. But it doesn't stop us from ticking the Fijian box. And this is the irony of the whole thing, is because if some people are already ticking the Fijian box because they've got a passport from Fiji in terms of their nationality, but also people loosely think and identify themselves and perceive themselves genuinely to be Fijian people. So we have got some of our people who are ticking Fijian. We've got some of our people who are ticking Fijian Indian, who are identifying themselves as Fijian Indian. And we also have some of our people who identify themselves as Indians. And when you look at these stats form, there is an option, and it just becomes easier for people to take Indian. And of course, people might genuinely also identify themselves as Indians. And we can identify ourselves in multiple ways, so that's not a problem. Now, we spoke to Stats New Zealand and we said, look, when people identify themselves as Fiji Indians or Fijian Indians, they don't know that their response will be coded as Asians. And so when we talk to people about this, and people actually, they're surprised, right? Because they don't know how the coding system works. And there is a lack of knowledge and awareness about this whole issue. But the bigger issue is, regardless of what you identify yourself as, in the stats form, in the census form, the bigger core issue is, who are we in terms of our collective identity? And how are we perceived by government agents, by social agencies? Because this is important in terms of policy making. And even though you might call yourself Fijian, are you actually part of the official government Pacific Peoples Framework or not? And when we look at policy frameworks, we look at the data around those policy frameworks, which looks at the Fijian classification under the Pacific umbrella, we can see that the Fijian Indian data is missing. And there is no engagement, there's no consultation with the Fijian Indian people around that. So we continue to miss out on a lot of opportunities, resources, support systems, which are given to the people who are classified under the Pacific people. So we have had a discussion with Stats New Zealand, and they said, if you want to do a review of a classification change, it cannot be done for the next census. We got this answer last year in 2020, and the next census in New Zealand is 2023. So a review can only take place after the 2023 census, which would mean we can only make any significant change to classification from 2028. But personally, I believe it will not happen because the bureaucracy around consultation, it will take years and years, and you'll never get a consensus from certain groups of people. And it actually doesn't matter. It is one issue. Stats New Zealand's data collection is one issue. The way we are classified and coded is one issue. But the bigger issue is, when you think about people who are descendants of Gurmitias, who are they? Are they more Asian or are they more Pacific? Or do we have multiple identities? It's a blending of identities. And who is the Ministry of Pacific People? Is the Ministry of Pacific People a ministry for indigenous Pacific people only? Or is the Ministry of Pacific People, which is taxpayer funded, a ministry for all Pacific people, including us? And to me, it is this question that is more important than the ticking box of self-identification data, because people can tick whatever they want. And you don't take your census form with you wherever you travel and say, hey, here's my census form, I've ticked Fijian, or whatever you've ticked. And if you're born in Fiji, or you're a descendant of people who are born in Fiji, if you identify yourself, you feel Fijian, you feel Fijian Indian, you're a Tuman, you are Toke, whatever you are, we are all from Fiji Islands. We've got roots from Fiji Islands. We are from the Pacific, and therefore all of us should come under the governance of the Ministry of Pacific People, which means we should come under the official policy framework, the planning, the strategy, so that we are also part of data collection, we are part of research, we are given the support structure, we are given support around COVID. Our people qualify for education scholarships, which in some universities have got a very strict criteria. You have to be of a Pacific descent. Who is a Pacific descent person? And in some qualifications and programs, you have to be an indigenous person only to get those education scholarships. And research, for example, around diabetes, cardiovascular diseases, as part of the Pacific health policy frameworks, exclude our people. And it is really sad because we basically have high incidence of diabetes, we know that, stroke, cardiovascular diseases, and some of these are linked to Fiji and our lifestyle. And of course, in New Zealand, suicide is also a growing issue amongst Fijian Indians. So all the policy frameworks around the Pacific people who are getting targeted support, we are missing out on, including our youth. So this is why it's important that we are part of official policy framework for the Pacific people. And just to give you some examples, during COVID, there's a lot of support given for all Pacific brothers and sisters. But we continue to miss out. We're not part of the ecosystem of support. Pacific service providers, Pacific agencies, they do not connect with Fijian Indian community organizations. They do not engage with us. It is so difficult. You cannot just go around begging every provider and telling them who you are and why you should support us, why you should help us. Last week, we, Fiji Government Foundation, we collected funds ourselves to help our people with food parcels. And this week is Fijian Language Week in New Zealand, and we are celebrating Fiji Hindi, our Fiji Bath, at our own cost, at our own expense, through oratory and online workshops and videos around vaccination. We shouldn't be doing this. We should be part of Pacific Language Week, just like Fijian language, Niuean, Tongan, Samoan. So the discrimination, which is institutional, which is structural, a bit of unconscious bias, is real amongst our people. And this year, we have taken the issue to mainstream New Zealand media through the New Zealand Herald, through TV3, to Stuff New Zealand, to educate New Zealanders about the issue, to educate also our people about the issue, because it is not something we can just discuss amongst ourselves. We need to create wider exposure. And it is working. We are getting so many emails from people, our people, who are coming out and sharing their stories and more people are supporting us every day because they know it is not right. It is a human rights issue. It is unfair. And we just hope, that the government of the day will come to recognize us and give us the due respect. It is our moral obligation. It's also a human rights issue. And it's also an issue of our dignity, our mana, our self-respect. Current vaccination rollout for the Pacific people. Again, we are not part of it. And as a community, we have to mobilize our own people. We have to create our own systems to help our people, in terms of communication and engagement, because we are falling outside the Pacific framework. And the list of examples are so long to discuss in a brief presentation like this. But the bottom line is that we are all Pacific people. And the Ministry of Pacific People is not a ministry for only Indigenous Pacific people. It should be inclusive. It should respect diversity. It should embrace diversity. And the Pacific people themselves, the Samoans, the Tongans, and all our Pacific brothers, the literature clearly says there's so much diversity that already exists in terms of language, in terms of culture, in terms of different generations within each ethnic groups. So why not us? We are also diverse, just like you guys. So we are hopeful positive changes will come. And the disadvantage that our people are suffering, hopefully the gaps will be filled. And it's important to note that Pacific people does not imply homogeneity. It's an umbrella term to describe people from Pacific who are linguistically, culturally, and geographically distinct from each other. So the Pacific People's umbrella is already a diverse description of all the Pacific people who come under it. So you might be thinking, how many people live in New Zealand from Fiji who identify themselves as Fijian Indians? According to 2018 census, there is 19,000 of us, which is inaccurate. If you've come to Auckland, if you've been to New Zealand, you know we are here in big numbers. And it doesn't help when some people identify themselves in different ways, which they can, but the data is all over the place. And we need to bring the data together to understand how many of us live in this country and how many potentially, when you add up the numbers from your kids and your grandkids who were born in New Zealand, the numbers is pretty high. It's close to 100,000 easily. Because when you look at the data from the Indian breakdown, at least 50% of them were born in Fiji and the Pacific Islands, which excludes New Zealand. And then you begin to create a story and understand how many of us are here, but the stats data do not show that. And that's something we are working with Stats New Zealand to, and of course with our people, to improve engagement around census and again around census so that we can have greater participation and the quality of data can also improve. So Stats New Zealand is one side of it, but the bigger issue is the government of the day that needs to give us the recognition, respect, and formal endorsement of people who belong to the Pacific. You cannot just say you're Pacific to come to New Zealand as a skilled migrant. We must be part and parcel of official policy framework. And, the examples, as I said before, there are too many examples, in terms of workforce development in health sector, we need to make sure people are culturally skilled. Again, we need to identify the differences between different groups of people, and our people have their own requirements. We've got our own migration journeys, our own culture, our own language. And the fact of the matter is that if we're not part of the system, then the workforce planning will not take our people into account. So research, design, and delivery of service should take into account who Fijian Indians are, because we are a big number. And for our youth, for our young people, it is about a sense of belonging. It is about equality. It is about fairness. It is about their mental health. Identity is important. And the bias, institutional, and structural discrimination must stop. It is time to stop. Fiji Government Foundation and myself will continue to work hard in advocating for our people. And I'm sure there could be similar issues our people are facing in other parts of the world. And where possible, we need to collaborate and have a collective voice to improve the outcome of our people, because we don't want another Gurmit for people to live in foreign countries. We've worked hard, but our people are also struggling in certain areas, and we cannot take it for granted that all descendants of Gurmitias are well off. A lot of our youth, a lot of our young people need support and help. And unless you're given recognition, respect to your identity, it is very difficult to achieve that. Thank you everyone for listening. And I hope to see you all and hear some questions that you might have in the upcoming few days. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Chris, and I can see that you have joined us. Welcome to the session, and I'm sure there would be questions for you. I can see your face now. You may want to say hello.
Hello to everyone. Bola, namaste, namaskaram. Thanks for the opportunity, Sunil ji. I just want to highlight something to everyone. Please go onto the TV1 New Zealand website today. It was a breaking news today around identity for Fijian Indians in New Zealand. So, and it's been covered in the news today extensively in New Zealand, the issues we are facing as a community and the discrimination around our identity. So you could read that article as a supplementary article to the session that you've just watched. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. It's a sad story of exclusion and discrimination that you have related. Just to add, I have seen the global data on the Indo-Fijian migrants to New Zealand. And according to that, from 1978 to 2012, 60,000 Indo-Fijians migrated to New Zealand. Now add another 10 years to it, or 9 years to it, which could easily mean 65,000. Now, if you do some calculations, people who would have migrated forward to Australia and so on, who would have passed away and so on, I think there would be still at least 40,000 original, Indo-Fijian migrants in New Zealand. So that's
easily over 100. Yeah.
Yeah, including the children, it would be, the
absolutely who are born here and the descendants here.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
Yes.
So that's
it's really interesting because we've got COVID happening in New Zealand now globally, and in today's 1 o'clock press conference, TV1 might ask this question to the minister: how many percentage of Fijian Indians are vaccinated in New Zealand? We don't know. You know, they talk about the Pacific data, but they exclude us in their data. And we don't even know how COVID cases in New Zealand are classified. Are they classified as Asians or are they classified as Pacific? And again, you know, the way it's reported, the way it's recorded has real implications for our people.
Yeah, that's a sad story. Huh? The consequences of this exclusion actually is dire. It's terrible, and good that you have stood up to address that anomaly. Hopefully, and I know this kind of data collection, the change in the format of the statistics does not take very long. I think it's a matter of law, it's a matter of legislation. It should not take 2 years. If you put it across now, I think it should be included in 2023 census.
Unfortunately, 2020, we went and met Stats New Zealand and they told us it cannot be included in 2023. There's a huge bureaucratic process, consultation that takes years and years. But the bigger question is, even if we get our people to take or identify themselves as Fiji Indians or Fijian Indians, the bigger question is, do the providers, do the government agencies, when they think about a Fijian Indian face, are we thought about as a Pacific person? So there is this ongoing unconscious bias, institutional discrimination, but also racial profiling. So I think it's about creating awareness and education to all stakeholders about who we are. And of course, good data collection will really be supportive of that.
Thanks, thanks, Chris. I just have to kind of wind up for the reason that Anjali, who is joining us from Udaipur, India, there may be some questions for her. So, so let's open the session up for question and answers. And then if you want to add something more, then we will have you at the end. Huh?
No problem. Thank you.
Yes. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we open the session up now for question and answers, and Anjali is here. If you have any questions or any questions for Chris, please, you can put your hand up in the system, raise your hand, and then I will get you in to put up your question. I can see 20 participants. If there is any pressing question, yes.
Mansraj Ramphal, Trinidad and Tobago.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you very much, Dr. Anjali, for your presentation. I spent 2 years in England as a student myself, many years ago. We have to understand that much of the crisis of identity has its genesis in the indenture experience. During those days, not so long ago, the Indians in the Caribbean were taught to hate themselves, to hate their culture by the British colonizers, the missionaries, the teachers, and the converts to the British way of life. Strange enough, many Indians accepted this inferiority complex up to today. And with respect to names, the missionaries changed their names to Christian names, and you needed to be Christianized to get a job, a good job like a teacher, a clerk, and so on. If you were Hindu or Muslim, you were denied those jobs. And over time, including up to today, Indians have been voluntarily changing their names to get a job. I had an interview recently with a headmaster, 84 years old, and he told me he was, because of the different civilization, just like Chris in the UK, the example you mentioned, this 84-year-old head teacher in a Canadian mission school, was ashamed of his mother's name in Trinidad, Durgi, which of course is Durge or Durga, a highly respected name. of a deity. In the smaller islands of the Caribbean, Indian first names and surnames have almost completely disappeared, and they have been replaced, first names and surnames, by English names. All that remains is curry. There's just a comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Rampalji. I actually was very keen to take up a story, at least to focus on a story that was based out of the UK, because the UK was also the former colonizing power. So the patterns of prejudice that come into multiple forms of marginalization are also based on race, the nationality, gender, class, and region. And how the location of the self then becomes important, because here, like you just pointed out, this is the former colonizing power. And these are the people who've actually been behind the whole system. And here they're getting away and continuing to practice that pattern of prejudice within their own country as well, and specifically to the twice migrants. So what you've just said highlights exactly what I was trying to say. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Anjali.
Okay. Here he is.
The government knew that such abuses were taking place, and it could not have prevented the said abuses, and still did not do anything to stop it. And furthermore, a further ground is established, which is the breach of the colonial powers' duty of care. The Mau Mau case was relied on the specific legal rules and provisions, which is according to Part 3 and Part 24 of the Civil Procedure Rules, Article 11, 14, and 33 of the Limitations Act 1980, British Settlements Act 1887, Foreign Jurisdictions Act 1890, Section 3 of the Emergency Powers Order in Council 1939, Vienna Convention on Succession of States in respect to treaties, succession of states in respect to state property, archives, and debts. Finally, Part 5. Before any claim or action is initiated against the British government, it is important to resolve to some examination of academic and research arguments on the case for the descendants of indentured Indians of Fiji, and a procedural history is planned out comprehensively. Based on the principles as applied in the Mau Mau case, the case of the descendants for the Fiji Indians will revolve around an action for damages for personal injuries brought by an internationally accredited organization of both repute and standing, such as the Global Grimmett Institute, GGI, and the international practice barristers who will be engaged or who have years of experience in respect to claims for torts of assault and battery and negligence, and for which the defendants in this case will be the United Kingdom, and its representative body would seek compensation, which will be the descendants of the indentured Indians, against the British government, who are liable and responsible for such crimes against the descendants of the indentured Indians of Fiji. The liabilities and responsibilities are shifted to the United Kingdom as a defendant in this matter, as it was the duty of care which was owed to the descendants of the indentured Indians in Fiji after independence, and the defendant, being the United Kingdom, had created such situations, both political, economical, and social, which has affected the sustainability of special case of people who were the responsibility of the United Kingdom. That the allegations are well-founded and that the claims would be properly assessed at the time against the perpetrators of their various forms of human rights violations, crimes against humanity, inhuman and vexatious liability, as well as injuries suffered by the descendants of the indentured Indians in Fiji. In order to mount an international legal challenge against the United Kingdom, the following questions need to be examined. Number one, international legal challenge needs a purpose. It needs to be examined. It needs case laws. It needs critical analysis. It needs legal proceedings. Number two, there is an opportunity for international arbitration. Number three is also an international mediation opportunity that could arise from initiating this matter. Number four, other international dispute resolution mechanisms could be employed. Number one, an open letter to the Queen of England demanding an apology. Number two, a bipartisan approach an open apology by the British Parliament and accepted by all members of the House of Commons and the Lords. Number 3, an open apology by the Fijian Parliament. Number 4, an open apology by the Indian Parliament in India. Number 5, an open apology by the Australian Parliament, including the Parliaments of New South Wales and the Parliament of Queensland. And number 7, an open apology by the European Union. Furthermore, number 5, recognition of all Indians born in Fiji after 1916 to become a British subject. The grant of a dual passport for the descendants of indentured Indians born in Fiji. The establishment of a compensation fund for the descendants of indentured Indians and their descendants. The international legal remedy would be the compensation by the British government to be assessed by the court or by the international body representing the descendants of the indentured Indians. In conclusion, it is important that all agreement-related organizations, researchers, academics, and organizations, both religious and political, that are products and byproducts of the indentured system in Fiji, such as the Sanatan Dharam Pratinivi Sabha of Fiji, the Arya Samaj of Fiji, the Brahmin Prohit Sabha of Fiji, the 10 India Sangrama Inkra Sangam, Fiji, the Dakshina India Andhra Sangam, Fiji Muslim League, Ahmadiyya Muslim League, Ahmadiyya Anjuman Islam, the Sikh Association of Fiji, Shri Satya Sai Baba Organization of Fiji, Gujarati Association of Fiji, Hare Krishna Movement of Fiji, Fiji Kisan Sangh, Fiji Sugarcane Growers Association, Fiji Labour Party, Fiji National Federation Party, Fiji Football Association, and other organizations and institutions that are products and or byproducts of the indenture system. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, without unity, the international legal challenge could not be mounted, and a case for the descendants of Fiji Indians would be a dream only. And it is my humble request that the case of Mau Mau be given due consideration, and there is a legal challenge that could be mounted against the British Crown, the British government, for the benefit of the descendants of the Fiji Indians and the indentured Indians that came from India to Fiji between 1879 till 1921, and the descendants that have stayed back in Fiji from 1921 all the way till today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Krishna Raju. Brilliant presentation. Wish you were there. We would have heard your full presentation. We only could play part of your presentation in this session, but surely the point has been made. The Mau Mau case is a huge one. The British, the brutality of British in Kenya and Greater Africa is being highlighted. Of course, British government will do its best to save itself from the responsibility. And same applies to the claims that may be made by the Girmitia community around the world. Surely we need to start somewhere. There's a lot of hesitation around this, but where are we going to start? In Fiji, in New Zealand, as we have heard Chris Naidu explaining how the exclusion and the discrimination is going around, it is time, I think, we should stand up and at least provide some degree of resistance to this. And making claims on the British government would be one of the most important ways of putting up this fight. So I'll again open up the session for questions and answers. We have about 10 minutes from now. Farzana, are you there? Mansraj,
Satya wants to ask.
Okay, Satya. Satya, please go ahead.
Yes, definitely very interesting. Looking at all these legal implications of the agreement. I think this is very long overdue. The sufferings that the Grimitians they have gone through under the indenture system, and especially the ladies, our mothers, as far as going as being raped on the farm and all that. So definitely an apology from British, Indian, and Australian government to come on board. That is very important. And we should work hard on that and see that, we put up a case like that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Satya, for your comments and your observations. Are there any more questions? We would definitely want to see some more questions so that we can listen to some of the very interesting descriptions of situations and cases that could come out of this. Krish, you were talking and then I had kind of interrupted. Do you want to continue? We have a couple of minutes. Huh?
Okay, thank you. So last week, a Fiji Indian girl reached out to me from a major university in New Zealand, and she applied for scholarship under the Pacific category, and she was declined. Now, the thing is, what's happening in educational institutions is that in programs where there is lack of space, our people get the Pacific recognition because universities want government funding. But in programs where there is competition and a fight for space, the criteria and the benchmark is raised. You have to be a indigenous Pacific person to get those scholarships. So one of the great things about taking this issue to mainstream New Zealand over the past year has been week after week, we're getting stories about discrimination our people are facing in many, many different areas. And I just hope, and I'm very sure there are other examples out there in the rest of the world where we may be able to find some common grounds and lobby and advocate together.
Thanks, Chris. Lomas, Loma, are you there? Would you want to put across your questions or comment? Loma, are you there? I can see your comment. Okay. All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have had a very interesting session this morning. I think this is about the second last session for the whole conference. I would like to take this opportunity to thank you and thank the organizers and presenters for your hard work. And I am sure that the issues that have been presented here, we would proceed with our research, and surely we would very soon meet, definitely in 2 years' time when the conference happens again. So ladies and gentlemen, we close this session. Thank you very much for participating.